It was one of those nights where the stars seemed to whisper ancient stories of love, loss, and redemption. The disciples sat closely around Jesus, a cool breeze carrying the scent of olive trees from the hills surrounding them. The day had been long, filled with countless people seeking healing, both physical and spiritual. The sick had been made whole, the hopeless had found faith, but among the disciples, there was still a lingering heaviness. Though they had witnessed miracles and heard his teachings, the weight of the world's suffering pressed down on their hearts. They sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the fire. Jesus, sensing the burden they carried, knew this was a moment for more than words. It was a moment for a story that would reach deep into their hearts, offering them the healing they so desperately needed. His voice broke the quiet of the night, soft yet filled with a quiet authority that drew their attention. "There was once a father," he began, his eyes reflecting the firelight, "a man of deep wisdom and love. He was a man whose heart was open, whose love for his 2 sons knew no end. He was respected in his village, a man who had worked hard to build a life for his family. His fields were vast, his home was filled with warmth, and his heart was full. But like all families, they were not without their struggles." The disciples leaned in, their weariness momentarily forgotten, as Jesus continued. "The father had 2 sons. The elder son was steady, responsible, and faithful. He worked beside his father every day, tending to the fields, managing the household, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. He was the one his father could always count on. The younger son, however, was different. He was restless, filled with dreams of adventure, and the world beyond their small village called to him like a siren's song. One morning, as the sun was just beginning to rise, the younger son approached his father with a request that would shake the foundation of their family. "Father," he said, his voice eager but insistent, "give me my share of the inheritance now. I want to live my life to see the world, to find my own path." The father, though pained by the request, did not argue. He saw the fire in his son's eyes, the longing for freedom and adventure, and he knew that no words would keep him home. And so, with a heavy heart, he divided his wealth, giving the younger son what he had asked for. The son, filled with excitement, left that very day. His heart was light, his eyes full of dreams, and he didn't look back. Here, Jesus paused, allowing the weight of the son's departure to settle over his listeners. The disciples were quiet, imagining the pain of the father, watching his son walk away, knowing he might never return. The young man traveled far from home, to cities filled with lights, music, and excitement. For a time, he lived as he had always dreamed, each day an adventure, each night a celebration. He spent his inheritance freely, surrounding himself with people who laughed at his jokes and praised his generosity. He felt as though he had the world at his feet. But as the months passed, the money in his purse grew lighter. The once lavish feasts became smaller, the friends who had once crowded around him began to disappear, and soon he found himself alone in a city that no longer cared for him. Jesus' voice grew softer as he described the young man's fall, and the disciples' hearts ached with the weight of his mistake. Not long after, a great famine struck the land. Food became scarce, and without money or friends, the young man found himself destitute. Desperate, he sought work, but the only job he could find was feeding pigs. A job that was not only degrading but forbidden for him, as it was considered unclean in his culture. Day after day he stood in the mud, watching the pigs devour the scraps that were thrown to them, his own stomach aching with hunger. The smell of the pigs filled his nostrils, the cold of the nights cut through his thin clothes, and he felt utterly lost. One night, as the stars hung above him like distant memories of a life he no longer knew, the young man collapsed by the pig pen. His body trembled with sobs, his heart heavy with regret. He thought of his father, of the warmth of home, of the love he had thrown away in his pursuit of pleasure. Tears fell from his eyes as he whispered to the night, "What have I done? Even the servants in my father's house have enough to eat, and here I am, starving and alone." In that moment his pride shattered. He realized the depth of his fall, the foolishness of his choices, and with that realization came a new resolve. He knew he could never return as a son, for he was no longer worthy. But perhaps his father would take him back as a servant. It would be enough, he thought, just to be near his father again, to work in the fields and live among the people he had once taken for granted. At this point, Jesus paused, his voice filled with a deep sadness that resonated with the disciples. They could feel the young man's despair, his longing for redemption, his fear that he might never be forgiven. The young man began the long journey home, each step heavy with the weight of his shame. His clothes were ragged, his feet blistered, and his heart full of fear. As he walked, he rehearsed the words he would say to his father. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Take me on as a hired servant." He repeated these words over and over in his mind, unsure if he could even bear to look his father in the eyes. He had no right to ask for forgiveness, no right to even hope that he would be welcomed back. But still he walked, driven by the faint hope that his father's love might still be there, waiting for him. Jesus' voice grew more intense as he described the young man's journey. The disciples could feel the tension, the uncertainty, and the young man's desperate need for redemption. Now, what the young man did not know was that every day since his departure, his father had stood at the edge of the fields, watching the road, waiting. Each morning, the father rose with the dawn, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of his beloved son. He longed for his return, his heart aching with the absence of the child he loved so deeply. And though the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the father never gave up hope. His love for his son was too great to be extinguished by time or distance. And then one day, as the sun was setting and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the father saw a figure on the road. At first he wasn't sure. It was a distant silhouette, moving slowly, hunched over as if carrying a great burden. But as the figure drew closer, the father's heart began to race. He recognized the way the person walked, the shape of his shoulders, the way his head hung low in shame. It was his son. Without a second thought, the father ran. He ran as fast as his legs would carry him, his robes billowing behind him, his heart pounding with a mixture of joy and sorrow. He had waited so long for this moment, and now it was here. As he approached his son, he saw the boy collapse to his knees, his body trembling with sobs. The son, overcome with shame, could barely speak. "Father," he choked, his voice thick with tears, "I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But before he could finish, the father knelt beside him, wrapping his arms around his lost child, pulling him close as if he could shield him from all the pain he had suffered. Tears streamed down the father's face as he held his son, and in that embrace, all the years of separation melted away. The son wept in his father's arms, overwhelmed by the love he was being shown. He had expected rejection, anger, perhaps even punishment, but instead he found forgiveness. He found the unconditional love of a father who had never stopped waiting for him, never stopped hoping for his return. The father stood, lifting his son to his feet, and called to his servants. "Bring the finest robe and put it on him," he said, his voice filled with joy. "Place a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Prepare the fattened calf, for tonight we will feast. My son who was lost has returned home." The servants hurried to obey, and soon the son, who had once been clothed in rags, stood dressed in the finest garments, a ring of honor on his finger and sandals on his feet. The household buzzed with excitement as preparations for the feast began. Music filled the air, laughter echoed through the halls, and the son, who had once been lost in a faraway land, now sat at his father's table, surrounded by love. Jesus paused again, allowing the disciples to absorb the depth of the Father's love, the overwhelming joy of the reunion. Many of them had tears in their eyes, moved by the story's emotion. But the story does not end there, Jesus continued, his voice soft but steady. As the celebration unfolded, the older brother, who had been working in the fields, returned home. When he heard the sounds of music and saw the celebration, he was confused. He approached one of the servants and asked, "What is going on?" The servant replied, "Your brother has returned, and your father has ordered a feast in his honor." The older son's face darkened with anger. He had worked hard, remained loyal, never once asked for more than what was given to him. And yet, here was his younger brother, who had squandered everything, being celebrated. His heart burned with resentment. He refused to go inside. When the father heard of his older son's anger, he came outside to speak with him. "My son," the father said gently, "why do you stand out here while we celebrate?" The older son's voice was sharp with bitterness. "All these years I have served you faithfully, never once disobeying your orders. Yet you have never thrown a feast for me. But when this son of yours, who wasted everything you gave him, returns, you celebrate his return." The father looked at his eldest son with deep compassion. "My son," he said softly, "you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we must celebrate and be glad, because your brother was lost and has been found. He was dead, but now he lives." The older son stood in silence, his heart conflicted. On one hand, he had every reason to feel anger. After all, he had been the faithful one, the responsible one. But as he looked into his father's eyes, he saw the depth of his love, not just for the younger son but for him as well. The father's love was not divided, it was endless, boundless. And in that moment, the older son felt the weight of his own pride lift, replaced by a deep sense of peace. The father embraced both of his sons, one in each arm, and together they entered the house where the feast was waiting. As Jesus finished the story, he looked at his disciples, his eyes filled with the same love and compassion as the father in the story. Many of the disciples were now openly weeping, moved by the profound message of the parable. "You see," Jesus said, his voice filled with tenderness, "we are all like the younger son at some point in our lives. We stray, we make mistakes, we lose ourselves in the world. And like the older son, we sometimes believe we must earn our place in the Father's house. But the truth is, the Father's love is always there, waiting for us, whether we have wandered far or remain near. It is a love that does not judge or condemn, but embraces and restores. It is a love that heals, that forgives, that welcomes us back no matter how far we have fallen." The disciples, overwhelmed by the depth of the story, sat in silence, their hearts full. Some of them were still weeping, but their tears were no longer of sorrow. They were tears of release, of healing, of a profound emotional catharsis. In that moment, under the vast sky filled with stars, they felt the weight of their burdens lift, replaced by the quiet joy of knowing they were never truly lost. They had found their way home, just as the younger son had, and they knew that no matter what happened in their lives, the Father's love would always be there, waiting for them with open arms. And so, as the fire crackled softly and the night deepened, the disciples rested in the peace of knowing that they were loved, that they were forgiven, and that they were never alone. This is end of the story. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.